Welcome to the Solid Signal podcast for the week of February 25th, 2019. I'm recording this on a Monday, as I always do, and I'm finding that, last night was the Oscars, and I stayed up for it, and I don't know if you did. And as usual, I regretted doing it. Every year I pick on the Oscars, and to some extent it's fair, and to some extent it's not fair, because it's really just a reflection of whether or not there have been good movies in the past year. And the Oscars has some structural problems, and not just the award show, but the award picking process, they're working on that, and I give them credit for working on that. But let's talk about the show, and let's talk about the entire idea of movies in general. First of all, a lot was made of the fact that the broadcast didn't have a host, and I got to tell you, I couldn't really tell the difference. For the most part, the host seems to disappear after the first 20 minutes anyway, and it's just not something that really makes a difference to me. I would just fast forward past it if it was there anyway. I think that depending on how old you are, you look at the days of Bob Hope or Billy Crystal or whatever, maybe Jimmy Kimmel, and you think, okay, this is the best that it gets host-wise. I just didn't miss it. And I'm kind of curious to see if any of you did either. I'm going to read a bunch of stories today on the internet and see what everybody thought about it. But my thought was, not a big deal. The show didn't run as long as it normally did, and I think that's probably because the host wasn't taking up 20-25 minutes with a musical number or a comedy routine that really people don't care about, and they just want to get to the awards. But the awards themselves are a reflection of two things. First of all, the number of movies that are out there that are truly good and worthy and deserving, and this year there, again, weren't that many. I think this was actually a better movie year than last year, when we had some real clunkers that won awards, and, of course, the critics really just loved them, but I've yet to find a lot of people who really cared how many billboards were outside of Ebbing, Missouri, and to be very honest with you, I found that movie boring and tedious and uninteresting in every single way. This year, I could say the same thing about Green Book, a relevant story, but not told in a terribly unique way. And I think that a couple of other movies that were also extremely relevant were not really recognized at the Oscars, and I don't know why. And the point is that, Green Book was, and The Favorite was, and these are not movies that are necessarily lighting up people. They're not the best made movies. It occurred to me as I was listening to the Oscar for Best Score being announced, and there were so many good Oscar scores that were played at this telecast, and none of them were from this year, of course. They were all things that you really remembered, like Jaws and like The Godfather, and even Hairspray was mentioned. And if you think about it, there are tons and tons of great movie scores, and none of them happened this year. I'm not trying to say anything bad about the hardworking people who put together movie music this year, except for there's a difference between timely and timeless, and I'm not quite sure if any of the movie scores quite got up to that level of timeless this year. But really, when you think about it, in my opinion anyway, and I guess this whole podcast is my opinion anyway, the whole idea of a movie is kind of obsolete. It seems like a lot of people agree with me, because it seems that from what I've researched, the average person goes to about 3 movies a year. That's barely enough to keep up with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, especially if you throw in a Star Wars movie every so often. That means that a lot of people just are skipping movies in the theater. And if they watch them at all, they're watching on streaming. And I'm sure that streaming and rental and stuff like that accounts for a lot of revenue now. But the movie theater experience really doesn't light people up. Why? Well, I think that we've just kind of evolved past the movie format. There was a time that as people, we were really only willing to hold on to about 2 hours worth of information. There was no internet. There was no way to discuss stuff. You saw a movie, it was a good movie, it was a bad movie, and you were done. And 2 hours is just about all you need for that, to see if it's a good movie or a bad movie. And most movies come and go. Especially in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of movies were made, and then promptly forgotten. And the very, very few that survive as classics today, it's, 0.1% if you think about it. And those are movies that were so good and so well crafted that they managed to tell a whole story that really meant something in 2.5 hours. It's very hard to do that. It's hard to tell a story in what is a relatively short period of time. And when you look at the stories of how they made movies like The Godfather and Gone with the Wind, these were extremely long books, and it's very hard to adapt a long book into a 2-hour movie. The last time anybody really tried at that kind of scale was, I guess, adopting the Lord of the Rings books, which, they still had to cut out a ton of stuff to keep the 3 books under 12 hours of movie time. And that's okay, because, now that people have streaming, now that people have the internet, now that they can watch on their time, it seems like the better format is the limited series. You could look at something like Russian Doll, which aired on Netflix recently, as a single movie of about 4.5 hours in length. It was 8 half-hour episodes, but that's not the point. You could watch it as a single 4.5-hour movie if you wanted to, and there are plenty of examples where limited series work a lot better to tell much longer stories. Russian Doll would have been much more compressed and much more compact if it had been a movie of 2.5 hours in length, and that would have been a shame, because I think the show needed to take its time to really let you know how it was going to deal with some of these issues. And not everything was super necessary, but I think a lot of it would have been sliced out to make it a 2.5-hour movie. Probably the banner example of this is Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones, as everybody knows, is at this point about 80 hours of filmmaking. And I say filmmaking because it's produced up to a movie budget and up to movie quality. And it looks like something around another 10 to 12 hours are coming in the spring. So we're really looking at about 90 hours of filmmaking to tell a single story. A story that goes from beginning to end. I will agree. Not everything in Game of Thrones needs to be there. They probably could have cut it down to 50 or 60 hours, and it would have been a lot tighter. You could have even cut it down to 40 hours, and it would have been pretty reasonable. But trying to cut something like Game of Thrones down to even 5 2-hour movies would have been practically impossible. And people love it because they can go on the internet, they can figure out what happened before and what's happening after, they can discuss it, it becomes a culture. And that's where we are today. And I think that's really better than just kind of the 2-hour one-and-done movie. Or even worse, the one movie that they're kind of hoping is going to be a franchise, and then maybe 2 years later they come up with a kind of half-hearted sequel to it, and nobody really wins there. It's actually a good thing, I think, that you're seeing the evolution of entertainment away from the 2-hour form into something that's a little bit longer and more developed. And although it doesn't necessarily mean great things for movie theaters or these tentpole movies, which are increasingly just passable CGI with the just thinnest bits of plot attached to them, that's okay. It's okay that we're finally evolving past that particular form of entertainment into something that's a little bit more complex. It's a good thing, as somebody would say. That's my thought for the week about movies and about what's going on in the lives of the average Solid Signal blogger. If you've got any comments, leave them wherever you find this particular podcast. You'll find it on YouTube, on the Solid Signal blog, and about 6 other aggregators. Feel free to let us know how you feel. And until then, have a great week.